My name is Mike Laverick. I work at VMware. I've been with the company for 3 years. I work within the VMworld team, within the SDDC kind of side of things. You might know me from my previous incarnation as Mr. RTFM. I used to run a website called RTFM Education in the early days, which was one of the popular blogs. We're going to do a kind of VMworld overview. We've got a lot of slides. So hold on to your hats because we've got a lot of content to get through. So this is the kind of relaxy bit before we actually bombard you with content. And joining me is?
So my name is John Ryan. I'm a systems engineer. I work in the kind of the mid-market business with VMware. So I cover pretty much all of the products there. So I'm going to be covering some of the issues here. I'm not Peter Van Oven. He's at the back of the room. But I have perfected his signature because he is my boss. So if you want me to sign any books, I'll do that at the end as well. So it's fine. And he gets commission on all of it, so it's fine.
So he also has his beard as well. He's developing a Peter Van Oven beard. So if you can be my spacebar monkey.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. So there was this thing called VMworld, which was in Barcelona. It was my 10th VMworld. So I've done every VMworld for the last 10 years in the US and EU. So I was joking when I first started doing VMworld. He said, "Yeah, VMworld," and then, "Yeah, I've got a session." And this year it was like, "Yeah, I really need comfy shoes." So you sort of, once you've gone through the mill of these sort of events for a while, they do sort of take it out of you. But I would recommend if you ever get the chance to go along to VMworld EU, it's not that far to go, and you can pick up lots of tips and tricks, network with people, and learn new stuff as well. And that's really all we want to say about VMworld itself. We want to get into the content as quickly as possible.
Cool.
So
yeah.
You do the intro bit.
So basically, this session is about VMworld, and many of you will have said, okay, you guys launched vSphere back in February, March timeframe. What the hell did you talk about at VMworld? And the answer is pretty much everything else that we're doing. So the theme of VMworld was this very nice marketing slogan, ready for any. But basically that just means talking about, building the infrastructure for today, but also thinking about what's going to happen with our IT down the line. So what we've tried to do today is break down the different sections and the things that we're going to talk about into kind of these different categories, which are all about running your data center, building the next generation of applications, delivering those applications securely to any device for consumption by end users, and then making sure that that can be done end-to-end in a secure manner. So we're going to talk about all these different areas. We're going to go through it quite quickly, but we've referenced other places where you can get more information all along the way as well. So, over to Mike.
Pretty much I'm going to do the opening bits, this is the SDDC stuff, and then you're going to do the hybrid cloud stuff. And vRealize, I'm going to talk about availability, and
We're not going to talk about
OpenStack, because neither of us know anything about it. Okay, so software-defined data center, it's this kind of buzzword that's been latched on to everybody in the industry. It's kind of interesting how VMware invents these new marketing concepts, and everybody then goes, me too. But I guess what really matters is the actual technologies that deliver the concept. So announced at VMworld EU was Evo SDDC, the product previously referred to as Evo Rack, which is kind of like a counterpart to the Evo Rail project, which is what I'm involved in. In case you don't know, what makes Evo SDDC or Evo Rack different from Evo Rail? Evo Rail is just a 2U appliance, doesn't really include any other hardware. Whereas Evo SDDC, we include top-of-the-rack switches and deploys a lot more products than Evo Rail does, which essentially just deploys vSphere currently, although that will change. We also announced the availability of vSAN 6.1 with a whole bunch of new features, which we're going to go into in a minute. But it was basically these two big components that were the core of the announcements within the SDDC. Yep. So as mentioned already, and we don't want to read out all these slides to you, but people often ask me, you're an Evo Rail guy and Evo SDDC, a lot of those technologies look the same. How are they different? And as I mentioned already, Evo Rail doesn't switch with an included top-of-rack switches, but Evo Rail EVO SDDC does. And the commitment to EVO SDDC is a little bit bigger than just a 2U appliance, which is what EVO RHEL gives you. So therefore, the commitment from the customer financially is that much greater. I guess the assumption is that you know up front that you're going to consume the resources, whereas the nice thing about hyperconvergence and buying your resources on a appliance by appliance basis is that you pay as you grow, you pay as you go, rather than having a larger capex cost up front. Next slide, please. So this, I kind of think, illustrates the difference between the different ways that we're doing hyperconvergence. So we're still talking about a system of servers with switches without necessarily including a storage array. The main storage that's being used across all of these systems is VMware's vSAN. And I guess the difference is that it is up to you what method you use to get to that kind of model of operating where a storage array doesn't really play any part in the environment anymore. So you can still go down the route of getting a vSAN ready node. These are just servers that are on the HCL and approved for use with VMware vSAN. It is up to you to lay down the software. About 50% of our customers still want to install ESX and Virtual Center manually. Yeah, they still want to have absolute control over all the settings and all the options. The other 50% of our customers have lost interest in doing that. They see no value in wasting valuable person hours, man hours, women hours, in putting together the core infrastructure stack that makes a virtual machine run. And they believe that their time is better spent on things higher up the stack rather than just putting the nuts and bolts of the infrastructure together. Yeah, I think it's interesting there's still a 50-50 split between customers who want to do that. That's not to say that first 50% are wrong, but it's just those 50% may have very specialized environments that need that level of customization, where a turnkey solution, which is for all and one purposes more rigid, yeah, in terms of what you can do with it, by definition, because it's prepackaged, is not a good fit for that particular customer. Yeah. So EVO RHEL is our 2U appliance. I work within that team. We're on the cusp of a 2.0 release of EVO RHEL, which will RTM within the next couple of days and GA before the end of the year. The main thing that EVO RHEL is bringing into the party is vSphere 6 and vSAN 6 with much bigger EVO RHEL appliances. So the first EVO RHEL that came out was a bit like a Model T Forward. You could have any color you liked, as long as it was black. The amount of memory, CPU, disk was the same across the 8 partners. And what we're doing in the new release is offering what we call hardware flexibility. So the number of cores, amount of memory, and amount of disk is now variable. We do have a maxi config planned. Our maxi config will be 2 terabytes per appliance of memory, yeah, 25 terabytes worth of raw storage, and I think something like 120 cores, or 120 cores for that appliance. And you'll be able to have 16 of those appliances all together in a rack. In other words, 64 nodes worth of compute power. So the EVO RHEL is getting bigger, but it's also getting more nodes in that cluster. And I think for a lot of people based in here in the UK, that is more than the amount of resources that they currently have. So there isn't any scalability limit. The difference, though, is how you go around purchasing that. If you know from day one that you're going to have 5,000 desktops in a big desktop plan, does it make any sense to build a skyscraper out of lots of Lego bricks? You're not leveraging the economies of scale with that particular project. And you might find something like EVO SDDC, or even something like a FlexPod or a VBlock is a more appropriate way of dealing with a project like that when you know for definite you're going to consume those resources. Where hyperconvergence in a smaller Lego brick works well is when you don't know that. You don't know whether your VDI project's going to stay at 200 desktops and then stall and not go any further, or whether it's going to be massively successful and the business turns around and says, we want another 300, another 500, another 600. Whenever I've been in that situation in most projects, you scope out your system for a certain scalability, and then management tends to move the goalposts and just say, we want more. But they don't understand that more means more resources and more money. Yeah. So sometimes a Lego brick approach works for people. Other times you need to go for a breeze block or a larger buy into that system. The other thing that you'll get from Evo SDDC is more products. So VMware does not at the moment implement NSX. It is on our roadmap, and we do not at the moment implement other vRealize technologies, but that's on our roadmap too. So this is a big long list of what you get in Evo SDDC, Enterprise Plus, vSAN, NSX, Login Site, the vRealize operations management, and then optionally, depending on what the nature of the project is, vRealize automation if you're doing a kind of self-service cloud, or Horizon Suite if you're building a vRealize Evo SDDC environment for desktops. Next slide, please. The Evo SDDC Manager is a piece of software that's been written by the team, which lays down all this software. You might ask, is this exactly the same software that is used by VMware? And the answer is no. And the reason it's different is deliberate, because the Evo SDDC project, its scope and what it wanted to actually do, which is configure physical switches and also configure all this other software, is a much larger undertaking than the VMworld project, which is essentially a glorified installer of all our products, together with a nice discovery system which discovers appliances on the network and asking the customer for all the variables they need to build out that environment. VMworld is a much more modest kind of software engine compared to the Evo SDDC. So it wasn't possible just to take what we'd written and then reuse it, because the goal of each of those two projects, despite the fact they both have the same name of Evo, is quite different from each other. Next slide, please. So moving on to virtual SAN. In case you don't know, what this does is share out all the local storage of an ESX host. You need at least one SDD, flash drive, and then whatever spindles that system can take. A personal comment from me, I often think that virtual SAN is a very misnamed product because it does encourage the comparison to a conventional storage array. Yeah. Now, virtual SAN and a conventional storage array, they're like fish bicycle in my mind. Yeah. All that virtual SAN does is store virtual machines for ESX and the hosts in the cluster. It doesn't do anything else yet. But if you look at a storage array, like a NetApp ONTAP or an EMC VNX, these systems have been around to offer data services, generic data services, to anything, yeah? Physical or virtual, Microsoft on physical, Linux on physical, Solaris, whatever you like, yeah? And so it's a bit of a false comparison to expect at the moment something like vSAN to do exactly the same as your conventional storage array. It's got a much more narrower kind of focus. That's not going to say that it'll stay that way forever. I noticed that Duncan Epping, in his sessions that he's been doing this week, has been talking about how vSAN wants to evolve into a unified data services system, yeah, being able to offer things like NFS and iSCSI connections. So that's something that's definitely on the vSAN team's roadmap and on their radar, but we're not there yet. And I think it's important, both for VMware and for customers, to talk about what we're doing now, not promising jam tomorrow, because anybody can promise something tomorrow, like vVols, for example, which took 4 years to get there. Yeah, so we have to make decisions based on our current needs and our, next year, next 2 years, rather than something that's 4 or 5 years out. Yeah, so space bargain. So a couple of improvements in terms of the availability. The big one for me, and there's lots here, and we'll probably share this particular slide as picking out things that really matter, was vSAN doing stretch clusters. So it is now possible using the fault domain feature and things like it to set up a vSAN environment which spans more than one site. Obviously, you are limited by something called the speed of light. Yeah, if you're not aware of this, you need to read a bit of Einstein. Yeah. So, distances and round trip times are as relevant here as they are in any clustering system. I once had a customer ask me, they had a site in Belgium and a site in Normandy, yeah, and they wanted to do active-active DR to these two locations. And I said, the problem that we have is the round trip time is too long for most clustering technologies. What can VMware do to fix this problem? And I said, what we'll do is we'll employ a team of engineers to forklift your entire site in France and make sure that it's less than 50 kilometers away from where you are now, and then we'll be able to do clustering. You know, don't expect VMware to break laws of physics. Yeah, there are limits to what anybody can do. So that was a big one for me. There are other things in this list, but I won't go through every single one. The other big one, I think, is the health plugin, which came through in the 6.1 release. vSAN has a number of prerequisites and requirements, and if they're not met, like any enterprise product where the prerequisites and the requirements aren't met, then you will have a warm and happy experience. And the new health plugin interrogates the vSAN environment to a much more rigorous level than the previous misconfiguration detected style method of health check, which should mean that people get a more smoother experience for setting up, but also when problems do occur, better information about what's going on. So one of the challenges in VMworld, which uses vSAN, is in the first release, actually detecting which disk had failed was actually quite difficult. So unless the disk LED had changed from green to red, and it was pretty obvious, or was black, if there was some sort of disk problem where the LED wasn't showing a different sign, it was quite difficult to find out which disk it was. And there was no method to blink disks to identify disks inside the vSAN cluster. Now that was pretty important when you think about the way vSAN works. vSAN has something called failures to tolerate. One disk failure, if it happens, triggers a failure to tolerate. So what do you think happens if you pull the wrong disk out of that system? Yeah? So therefore, identifying disks is pretty important. I think that's quite revealing, isn't it? Because that's the kind of thing that you would just take for granted on a storage array. You would simply not think about things like that. Yeah. In the storage arrays that I used to have in my rack, I had NetApp, I had EMC, I had Dell. I had all these storage vendors wanting to give me storage because I used to write books about VMware's Site Recovery Manager, DR tool that used storage replication. In fact, I had more storage than I had servers. It was a bit ridiculous. It's great when vendors do give you that gear, but obviously they don't pay to run it, yeah, which was a small mortgage. But I would do things like hot spares and, leaving things out of aggregates. So if a disk failed, it would just, a disk was already free. That's not something that you normally do in a vSAN environment, yeah. So cheap and deep storage just for virtual machines is quite different from generic data status services for all. I don't know whether you want to pick this up. I feel like I've been talking too much. It's meant to be a duo team. Yeah,
no, Mike pretty much covered everything there and more. But just from the availability side of things, as you were saying, it's an evolving platform. It's becoming more kind of business critical application ready. Two of the things I just point out is that there's now support for the multi vCPU fault tolerance that was introduced in vSphere 6. So that's now supported. Also, if you have vSphere replication between two vSAN clusters, you can get a 5-minute RPO instead of a 15-minute RPO. That's a fairly significant jump. And the other thing as well is just support for other application level clustering technologies like Oracle RAC and some of the Microsoft clustering capabilities like DAG groups and stuff like that for Exchange.
One of the things I didn't realize was there was support for a 2-node cluster. When I saw this slide, I didn't realize we were doing that already. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so basically we do have a configuration now where we have a configuration for remote office and branch office. So what you want to have inside a retail outlet or a remote office is probably just 2 servers that's going to be able to handle a high availability situation in the case of a server failure. So traditionally, we would have had to have 3 nodes in the vSAN cluster because we needed at least 2 copies of the data, and we had to have a witness component that would allow us to determine, okay, which one has failed. So what we've done is we've actually added the ability to take that witness and kind of virtualize it and have it sitting outside of the cluster, so to speak. So we can have that witness sitting on a VM that sits on a desktop machine inside in the remote office or whatever. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a whole server. So it just makes it a bit more economical for deploying small configurations.
Can that VM be in the cloud?
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. It's amazing. You were able to predict. Yeah. And it didn't seem like it was set up at all. So yeah, essentially we can run that VM off premise as well. We just need basically, I think it's a 1.5 meg connection and 500 milliseconds to the cloud, and we can.
To get that right, I should have gone. So John,
yeah.
That's really good. But
that's a very interesting question, Mike.
Well, thank you for that question, Mike.
All right, we better kick on, I think. So you can finish this one out.
Yeah, I finished this one out. So I guess there's two ways of approaching this. You can go down the vSAN route with a ready node, or you could go down the route of using our appliance, VMware. I think what's interesting is that we do give people the choice, and we have to, because 50% of our customers want to install and 50% just want to use. Yeah. So if we only had one of these offerings, we'd be alienating half of our customers. There are some cases where you might find a ready node is more suitable for you. So for example, with EvoRail, it's a 2U chassis with 4 nodes in. The MES slot that's on that EvoRail is full with the 2 10 gig cards to give connection to the switch. If you want to do things like NVIDIA or Teradata Apex for VDI, where you're accelerating the graphics or reducing the CPU hit of rendering, EvoRail isn't for you. You need a vSAN ready node with plenty of slots on the PCI bus in order to put those cards in order to do kind of high-end desktop replacement. So the form factor itself of EvoRail could be limiting to you. Not the amount of memory, CPU disk, or whatever, but actually the additional components that you want to put in. So it's always worthwhile looking at both and then seeing which is the appropriate one for your particular organization. Yeah. We have a number of sessions today. One that's running right this minute. So if you, now is your opportunity to leave if you feel so inclined. And then this afternoon, Lee Dilworth and Christos are going to do a deep dive on product roadmap on vSAN. So they'll be telling you what's coming next. In terms of hands-on labs, we do have a hands-on lab for vSAN. That's 1608. The EvoRail lab is 1628. That shows EvoRail 2.0, the new release. It's actually a tech preview of the bits as opposed to GA bits.
So you might be the clicker.
I'll be the clicker, right?
Great, very good. So
technical training has provided me with the skill to press this button.
he's uniquely qualified to do this job. What we want to move on to quickly next, and just kind of switch a small bit, is on to and some other announcements around what we call the unified hybrid cloud. So if you just click on for a second, Mike, just to explain what that means in real terms. We're not talking about this massive public cloud system to rule them all. He couldn't even do the one job he was given. Does anyone else want to volunteer to click for me? Thank you. So basically what we're talking about with the unified hybrid cloud is a combination of our vCloud Air offering, which is a public cloud offering based on VMware technology that we've had for the last 2 years now or so, in combination with this software-defined data center. So where everything inside in your data center is basically controlled in the software layer and really focused more on serving the VM and the application rather than on kind of managing individual parts of the infrastructure. So just to expand on that, effectively what we have is kind of these two options, and the two options we have for the implementation of this kind of unified hybrid cloud is either you can start in the data center, which is your kind of software-defined data center with all of your components in there, and you can take little bits and pieces and maybe test them out in the cloud. That's I deal with customers every day of the week that are putting their toe in the water and seeing, okay, is there a workload running in my data center today consuming power, cooling, compute capacity, rack space that is not really mission critical for me, and I could probably save a bit of money if I just used a pay-as-you-go model in the cloud, right? So they're starting to say, okay, maybe this test and dev workload, I can maybe run it in the cloud instead of running it on-prem. And it's that kind of gradual approach to the cloud that we're seeing a lot of people do. And the good thing about it is that because you have VMware technology on both sides of that fence, there's no conversion. Okay, you can take the VM that runs today in your data center and run it out in the cloud. Okay, there is a migration, there's a power down operation and a power up operation. That's getting much better. That's part of the updates that we've made in VMworld. But alternatively, we do, as Joe said this morning, have a different type of customer now as well who is starting in the cloud. So they're saying, I've got this idea, I don't know whether it's going to work or not. I'm just going to kick around that idea on a pay-as-you-go basis with my credit card. And you know what? If the idea works out and I want to productize it or I want to put it in production, and I want to do that in my secure data center that's compliant with all of my regulations, I can bring that workload back without any changes as well. So we have those two options. So we'll just move on there, Mike, as well. So as part of that, and kind of, I suppose we're gathering momentum with that kind of strategy now. And the key thing around the maturity of a cloud service is really not the infrastructure as a service bit. That's kind of essentially the easy bit, as Joe said this morning. There's a lot of infrastructure as a service vendors out there. A lot of them are VMware partners that provide VMware technology as the underpinning for their infrastructure as a service. But really, it's the add-on services on top that are really the ones that are going to add value to you when you're in the cloud. And these are the ones that really kind of allow us to differentiate our infrastructure as a service offering from others, be that kind of other public cloud vendors or even vendors who are using our technology as well, but are very much more focused maybe on a regional basis or on a compliance basis. So some of those things that we've added, so we've had a disaster recovery option in vCloud Air for about a year or so. So that allows us to replicate our VMs into the cloud, so that in the event of a disaster and our site fails, we can go to that cloud service and power up those VMs and get that application and service back up and running for our users. Okay, we've enhanced that a little bit by now actually layering an automation layer on top of that. So it's kind of SRM light a little bit for those of you who are familiar with Site Recovery Manager. It's kind of our orchestration layer for disaster recovery. We have an SRM as a service type offering now, and that's going to basically orchestrate the power up of those VMs when a failover action occurs instead of having to power them up all individually. Another big one is the advanced network and security. All I'm going to cover there is essentially that's NSX in the cloud. So we've implemented our network virtualization technology now in the cloud. And what that allows us to do is to replicate our entire infrastructure, our network infrastructure, layer 2 and layer 3, in a virtual network in the cloud. And we're only able to do that because we're implementing NSX. And that service is now available as part of the vCloud Air service. Hybrid Cloud Manager is your gateway to the cloud. This is the piece of software you install in your own data center. And this is the one that kind of establishes the connection to the cloud. So this is the tool you'll use to migrate workloads. So basically, there's an enhanced low downtime workload migrations service now. So if you decide, I want to take this VM and run it in the cloud, you can basically choose to migrate it. What will happen is that a replication job will happen in the background, replicating all the data. And once that data is replicated, you'll get a notification and say, do you want to now switch over to the cloud? You can say yes. Power down operation happens on-prem. Power up operation happens off-prem. And it's as easy as that. And that's a big enhancement, because if you wanted to do a migration before, you kind of had to transfer the whole lot. And you could have a little bit of downtime with that. The last two services there are very much kind of aimed at the application side of things. So now offering vCloud Air SQL, so it's a Microsoft SQL Server as a service. And that's kind of going to be on a pay-as-you-go basis. And that's offered not only as a standalone SQL service, but also as a DR service. So you can actually do SQL replication into this instance in the cloud, which means that you can basically protect your data off-site in the event of a failure. That's kind of cool. And the last one is the object storage. Insofar as, so very low-cost storage. Essentially, it's kind of fractions of a cent per gigabyte, or over time. And this is really where you have the huge scale-out storage. So Amazon S3 and stuff like that, this is kind of the equivalent. So you can point your archive data to the cloud. It's got like 5 nines availability, so that data will be there. It's replicated by the service provider. If you ever want to go back and pull that data, you can. But it basically potentially takes it off your very expensive on-prem storage or your very expensive storage that you're paying for in the cloud that's SSD accelerated. You can actually offload it there. So we have two flavors of that. Very low-cost option that we're reselling from Google. And we've also got a kind of EMC technology-based one as well that we're selling. So you might just move on there quickly. I'm going to very quickly go down through these. These are just some more services. So we've added Google's Cloud DNS service. So this is their global DNS service. So again, this is kind of a tool that you'll be able to use for ensuring that you can kind of point a single address to multiple instances or multiple locations, and Google's front-ending that, so you're getting all of the benefits of kind of the Google data centers and the Google availability there. For the service providers in the room, if there are any, vCloud Director, which is now a service provider only product, that's been revved to version 8, and version 8 is now compatible with vSphere 6 and the newest versions of NSX, which means that you can implement those technologies in your service provider estate, and that kind of gives you all the benefits of those technologies that we probably won't go into today because there's too many. But we've also added in things like monitoring APIs, so you can call into the APIs and say, how is my VM doing? So again, more programmatic access into how your service is operating. We're doing a lot of work around the containers side of things. So Joe talked about containers a lot at the start, or the first session today. We're aware that people want to build applications based on that technology. We're now kind of implementing our kind of Photon technology in the cloud as well. So if you want to do a kind of containers-based application in vCloud Air, it's kind of a first-class citizen. And the last one there is an interesting project called Project Michigan, and what it is basically a new way or an expanded way of doing networking in the cloud. So today, if you want to connect to your cloud service, you have to go through one gateway to get to kind of one set of services. This will basically allow you to put one gateway in front of many services. So you'll have one kind of target to hit your object storage service, your infrastructure as a service, your cloud DNS service. All of the services offered in vCloud Air will kind of be fronted by one kind of access point. So just making it simpler to consume. So just one last slide there on this. One of the big interesting things that we did at VMworld, and Joe mentioned it this morning, is that we demoed on-prem to cloud vMotion. Okay, and that's what we're calling Project Skyscraper. It's not productized yet, it's not there, but we're able to do it in a technology preview. And what this will do is allow you to take a workload that's running on-prem and migrate it live to the cloud. So I was talking about kind of migration earlier on with power down activities and power up activities. This is essentially no downtime migration to the cloud. Okay, and you think about when we extend that to other services, or we productize that and we make it available to our other service provider partners, you're talking about 400 service provider partners globally who will be able to offer VMware-powered services, and you can vMotion your VMs into any one of those, whoever will give you the best service or the most appropriate pricing for what you want to do. So there is a kind of a really good strategy around that. So you just click on there. So there's a couple of there's one session that David Hill is doing later on this afternoon. So that's just going to be covering this stuff in a little bit more depth, going into a bit more detail about what it's all about. There's also a nice number of hands-on labs available to just, check them out, have a look. We'll be sharing this deck afterwards as well, so you guys will be able to click through these directly and get to those labs. And it's really interesting just to kind of see how the migration and everything else works. So we'll go on from there. So this is you again, Mike.
Thank you for that. Okay, if you hit the clicker. Availability. So there's a couple of places where we've been making improvements to availability. I chose to take this particular section because it's about a product that I know and love, Site Recovery Manager 6.1. And as you can probably tell from the slides, there's three main areas where improvements are being made. The SRM system, when it first came out, was very much tied to storage arrays and LUNs. And what that meant was all the VMs that were in a particular LUN or volume all shared the same replication sequence, replication threads, which, that's fine for some applications, but I think in the modern world, people want more granularity, where on a per VM basis, they can control the replication for those VMs. And that's something that's been around for a while with vSphere replication, which came in the previous release. What's been done here is a bit more automation around as VMs move from different tiers of storage, from different types of policy. It means that they get different levels of protection based on how you classify them. The other thing that's been integrated, again, as you probably spot a theme here, is NSX. Previously, things like SRM would use either standard switches or distributed switches, and you'd have to go through quite a convoluted process of, have we moved on more than one slide? Can you go back a bit? You had to move on. He's trying to get me to speed up, that's why he's doing that. And so you had to map port groups from a distributed switch in the primary site to the DR location, things like it. And obviously it makes it simple if you use NSX to do that. And then finally, as people are starting to use Site Recovery Manager for orchestrated DR together with stretched clusters for automatic DR, when a site goes down, the VMs are restarted elsewhere. We want you to be able to orchestrate not just the movement of VMs from one site to another through replication threads, but also be able to do that when you actually do a storage vMotion or a vMotion of a VM from one site to another, so tying those two things together. Previously, synchronous replication, asynchronous replication as orchestrated by SRM and stretch clusters had settings and features that were kind of incompatible with each other. And so what's been done with the 6.1 release is trying to true up those so you can have the best of both worlds. Next slide. So as mentioned already, protection through storage policies. In previous releases of SRM, if you change settings around the VM, it would become unprotected, and you'd have to clean out settings from the VM in order to reprotect it and things like that. And that's what storage profiles and storage policies fix. As mentioned already, support for NSX. I imagine that many customers will carry on mapping distributed switches in the DR location to the main site, because that's something that's built into vSphere. But for customers who are going down the route of NSX, this is going to be attractive to them. I think the big thing here is this allows you, once you're using NSX, to do things like stretch VLANs, stretching layer networks across from two sites, which then removes the necessity to re-IP things. Without this sort of technology, the vast majority of customers, when they do failovers, have to re-IP things like Linux and Windows. So when they come up in the new location, they can carry on communicating to the outside world. That's something that we've done a lot of work on in SRM for a while to improve that. But at the end of the day, re-IPing Windows doesn't always mean that the application or service is aware of those changes. You still get applications that have unique settings in the registry, unique settings in text files, which reference an IP address, which is now being changed, and that means that service doesn't work anymore. So avoiding re-IPs, either by netting or stretching out the network, has been something that people wanted to do, but it's been expensive and complicated. And hopefully, by integrating with NSX, this will make it a simpler process in the future. Next slide. Most of the topologies that we have in SRM have been around for a while. You can have an active, passive scenario where you have maybe a co-location which is acting as your DR location. If you have two sites, they can be DR sites to each other, assuming there's enough resources, spare capacity, to absorb the failover that happens between one location and another. And we've had topologies like shared sites, which is really designed for ISPs and service providers to act as a target for DR. So your branch office DRs into that central repository, so SRM as a service, if you like. What's new is this active-active configuration, this active-active support, which allows for the live migration of VMs from one site to another, all orchestrated with the SRM recovery plans. Next slide. So we don't really have a session, but we do have people. Anybody interested in Site Recovery Manager, speak to me. I wrote 3 books on the product. Even though that book is now getting a bit old, the principles are the same. Lee Dilworth, who, if you don't know what he looks like, I will point him out to you and find him for you. He was my go-to guy whenever I had questions. Yeah. So if I couldn't find out the answer, I'd ask Lee. Yeah. So all hail Lee. So we don't have a SRM session this particular event, but we have the 2 most important people in SRM, apart from GS Casala, who's now the tech marketing guy for SRM. And we do have a SRM Lab 1605 if you want to see this product in action. Next slide, and I think we do our handover again.
Yes, very good.
Get the easy job.
Yeah, bloody hell, it's tough work. So basically what I want to cover just quite quickly is around the management announcements. So what we tend to see for the last year or 2 is that VMworld San Francisco does all of the kind of SDDC stuff, stuff around kind of maybe storage, Evo, all that kind of thing. The Barcelona event is very much kind of focused around the management software, because we have, some of you guys might not be aware, but we actually have a fairly comprehensive portfolio of tools to manage the data center now, beyond just vCenter. So I just want to quickly run through some of those. So the first one is our operations management tool. So some of you guys will have seen this, some of you guys will have this. It's essentially a tool that allows you to plug into vCenter, suck out all the data, store it over time, analyze that data, and use it for things like capacity planning, fault analysis, optimization of the data center. That's what it does. It's a really, really cool tool. I spend a lot of time talking to customers about it. And what we're doing is we're constantly evolving now what that intelligence that's built out of that analysis actually is able to do. So one of the first real implementations and one of the first real benefits we're starting to see of this now is something called intelligent placement and proactive rebalancing. So what this is allowing you to do is it takes advantage of the fact that vRealize operations can actually talk to multiple vCenters. Okay, so it's aware of multiple vCenters, it's aware of multiple clusters, it's aware of multiple constructs within those, okay? So we have DRS, obviously, within the cluster that does load balancing of workloads based on kind of load and stuff like that. What this actually allows you to do is do that balancing across clusters. So within vRealize operations now, we can actually create groupings of disparate clusters, different clusters, and we can basically load balance across the clusters. We can optimize the environment around that. So really interesting technology. I don't think we have a session on it today, but there's a guy called Matt Steiner who'll be floating around. He's the resident guru in all of this stuff. He's the right guy to go and talk to. Or you can talk to us after the session. The other big thing as well that we announced was that we've integrated the Hyperic, or a lot of the Hyperic agent-based monitoring into the core platform through our endpoint operations capability. So that means now that we can, in our enterprise edition of the software, we can actually pull in granular data from things like Oracle databases, from Microsoft Exchange, SQL Server, combine that with the infrastructure data as a kind of a data set to analyze and figure out end-to-end where problems might be. So if you're having an issue with an application or a user's complaining that something is slow, you'll be able to go into Operations Manager and track all the way down through the application, the VMware technology, the infrastructure underneath, where that actual problem is starting. It could be a dodgy NIC or it could be some sort of storage issue, but this will be able to highlight it straight away. And then the last thing, I guess, is really just around the ability to monitor our own technology. So we now have a lot of management packs for things like NSX, for vSAN, that are going to be included kind of out of the box for vRealize operations, which is going to make it much easier to see what's going on in any of these technologies that you've implemented from VMware. The other thing I just wanted to quickly give a shout out to, and Joe mentioned it this morning, Log Insight. Who's heard of Log Insight here, and who's using it? Okay, so this is one of our best kept secrets that's out in the open. This is an amazing little piece of technology. Essentially, you point all of your syslogs to it, and it basically converts it into Google. You can Google your logs, and you can build filters based on those searches. So that means that anything that pops up in your logs, any weird error message that you want to look out for, this thing can track it, and it can actually pop it up, and it can even alarm upwards into Operations Manager too. So what we've done with this technology is we've just improved the scale, and this thing scales to millions of objects, and it's got a scale-out architecture as well. So this is kind of, if you're talking about cloud native and cloud monitoring, this is the type of future state of a product. It's got to be able to scale to the millions and billions, as Joe said. And this is one of the first real ones that we have that can do that. And not only for your VMware stuff, but also for your applications. Click on there. So the next big one is vRealize Business. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking on this, but essentially there's been a couple of enhancements to this product. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a tool like the Operations Manager, except it does it for the cost of your data center. So instead of collecting the data from your vCenter and other parts of the infrastructure for monitoring purposes or for operational purposes, this does it and builds a cost model to tell you how much different resources are actually costing you. So you can put in costs like, how much does my power cost me? How much is my rack space costing me? How much is my cooling cost me? How much, what are all the operational costs of running my data center? And it can also pull in from a database that we have the actual cost of your hardware, and also work out what the depreciation on that hardware is automatically. So it builds a really good cost model for you, and basically gives you a dashboard of all of those costs. So you can say, hey, R&D department who are consuming all of my data center resources, this is how much that costs. Do you want to pay for it? Okay? And I think this is the big thing, being able to show the actual value that IT brings to the organization and show that actually, you know what, we're not the cost center. Everyone else who's consuming our service is the cost center. So just some of the enhancements, the hybrid cloud costing and pricing. So if you want to see how much this is going to cost to run or an application or a VM is going to cost to run in my data center versus Amazon or versus vCloud Air, we can put that side by side for you. Okay? How much is this vCPU count with this amount of RAM, with this amount of storage going to cost me on Amazon, vCloud Air, or if I run it in my own data center? That's really useful information. Also, we've leveraged some of the IP from the operations side for capacity planning and all of that sort of stuff, and we're now able to do some cost analysis based on the costing data that we have too. And the last one as well is just more enhanced kind of reporting to be more granular about kind of saying, okay, you know, this particular workload within the developer side of the house is taking a lot of resources. And Joe mentioned that massive VM, that massive Linux VM that they're hiding all their containers inside of. You can actually work out the cost of what's your container strategy actually costing you by costing out those VMs. So we'll move on again there. So we do actually have a much more in-depth session if this stuff sounds interesting. Peter and Sean are actually doing that later on this afternoon. Those guys will be able to go into this in a lot more detail, but it's a really interesting area. Again, we probably don't talk about it enough, but it's really good stuff. And then we have a really good hands-on lab on there as well. And the last section is around automation. So you guys are spoiled for choice today. If you guys want to find out more about this, because there's about 4 sessions across community sessions and VMware sessions that are dealing with vRealize automation. And for those of you who aren't aware of vRealize automation, it's essentially a layer that you can put on top of your resources, not just your VMware resources, but if you have, you know, physical resources, if you have stuff that runs in the cloud, if you have stuff that runs on OpenStack, this is a layer where you can basically put standardized templates or blueprints on top of those and roll those standardized blueprints out onto whichever endpoint that you want, okay? And do that in a very controlled way. Allowing you to say, you know, present them as an application catalog. You know, I want to consume this LAMP stack. I want that LAMP stack running on vCloud Air. I click a few buttons, request it. If it's prohibitively kind of, if you've said I want 16 virtual CPUs, that'll go to your manager, so their manager can say no, and then he can actually make a recommendation as to what's actually, you know, the right size for that. So you have a governance model. And then you have full lifecycle management of those workloads as well. So what we've enhanced in version 7 is that we've actually combined 2 technologies that we've had. We had one called Application Director. Some of you guys might know of that. It was just a way of kind of templating application builds. So you could say, this is the type of server I want. This is the type of database I want. This is the executable I want to drop into that, and kind of have that template built out. So we've combined that with the infrastructure blueprints now, the infrastructure templates. So that means that you can have one blueprint that defines how the infrastructure is built, how the application is deployed onto that infrastructure, how that application is configured, and all of that kind of stuff in one template. And Joe talked about infrastructure as code. We can actually do that with vRealize automation now, where we can just have a text file that describes what my application and infrastructure looks like, and vRealize automation will be able to go out to whichever endpoint you want and implement it. So really interesting stuff. The extensibility is really just an architectural change we've made. So before, if we wanted to add a new endpoint, like we wanted to add Azure, we wanted to add, you know, Oracle's kind of Oracle VM or something, we would have had to do a fairly significant forklift of code. We've now changed that, and we can basically write endpoint plugins for pretty much any type of endpoint that we want to point stuff to. So if something new comes along, we can ramp up a new connection for that fairly quickly. And we've also simplified the way that we deploy it. So anybody who's deployed vRealize automation or tried to deploy it will know that it can be a little bit tricky, but we've made it a little bit easier now. So just as I said, lots of different sessions. If you just click on there, Mike. So we've got lots of different stuff going on right now. You've kind of missed one of the community sessions, but there's pretty much a session on that track for the rest of the day. And there's a really good kind of getting started one around vRadio's automation on hands-on labs as well, if you want to kick the tires on that and see some of the new cool stuff. Right, so we're going to go very quickly through the next section because we are rapidly running out of time. So this is, happily Joe has covered most of this morning, so we can click through it fairly quickly. This is another thing we announced, the vSphere integrated containers, basically being able to run container workloads side by side with your VMware technology. And just a sentence, what does this mean? It means that if you invest and build out a vSphere infrastructure today, if somebody comes along and says our new application is based on containers, you can run that application on the same infrastructure without having to rip and replace. Okay, that's pretty much it. Photon, for those net new applications, realistically, this stuff is futures for me with the people I'm talking to, but this is the cutting edge. These are the cowboys that Joe was talking about. They're going to be consuming this stuff. But it basically, shows that we're thinking about what that next phase of application looks like as well. And the good thing is that when we're thinking about it, we're also thinking about how do we allow you guys to actually run it. I think that's the big thing. We're bringing the IT perspective to this rather than the developer perspective. So that's it. There's a session that was on with Robbie and Andy at the minute. Probably worth looking back at and talking to the guys if you are interested in this. They do have a breakout session as well, I think, in one of the side sessions. So if this is your cup of tea, go for it. That's probably going to be an interesting session for you. So we'll click on to the second last section, which is all about delivering applications to endpoints. So I'll give Mike back the mic.
Mike. Okay, so Project Squared is just a project to deliver app volumes, an acquisition that was made a while ago, cloud volumes, but to physical systems. So I guess this is a kind of acknowledgement from VMware that not everything is virtual. Not everybody runs virtual desktops, but they still have the same application management issues that they've had, even if they're on physical. There's no reason why we can't virtualize the application layer. So this separates the OS from the apps and allows it much easier to deploy the apps across many different systems. I think for the first time this year, we actually had somebody from Microsoft come on the stage with our executive team, which was a little bit weird, but it works because we're not competing in this particular space. We're working together. Next slide, please. Identity Manager. You might have come across a Horizon Manager in the past. This is a system that had a kind of SAML-style system for allowing a single login to a portal, which then allowed you to access many different applications that supported that protocol. Essentially, new functionality is being added in here and also plugged into the AirWatch acquisition as well. Next slide again. And then something that's a little bit more closer to my heart is Project Enzo. This is a project to accelerate the adoption of virtual desktops. From the infrastructure perspective, at the bottom, we're talking about things like Evo SDDC and Evo Rail as being the hardware platform for this system. And obviously your VMs may still, your virtual desktops may still execute on local gear on-prem, but there's no reason why the management layer of that virtual desktop environment can't be delivered as a SaaS-based application. So rather than you having to put together all the infrastructure, the connection service, the security service that used to make up Horizon 6 and previous versions of Horizon, this is something that you subscribe to. Yeah. This is something that we'll be doing very soon in the new year, is where this is coming. So this isn't far out, it is next year that is something that we'll be doing. Next slide. More detail, Spencer Pitts, who is our end-user computing expert, got a session on at 2:10. And again, a big, long list of sessions. I don't think we have anything that actually demos Enzo just yet, but you could get the experience of what Enzo would be like if you had a look at 1653 and the VMware Workspace portal.
I think there's some YouTube demos as well of what Enzo looks like. Yeah.
All right, okay.
So if you want to check it out.
And then...
This is the last section.
Yeah, and then we switcheroo again.
Yes, very good. This is seamless, right? You guys don't even see it happening. Sleight of hand. So if you guys are interested in NSX, you're in the wrong session now today, because there's another session running in parallel with Mike Armstrong. Well worth a look back over the video, because Mike is really kind of into the NSX stuff and everything. But we wanted to make sure that we covered off some of the new stuff that was talked about in relation to NSX in both the VMworld in San Francisco and in Barcelona. So really, NSX is a maturing platform now. Basically, the marquee feature that was added was the ability to do cross vCenter instances of NSX, which means that you can have one network basically running across two sites. That's what enables things like the SRM integration. And what it really means is that you can build out a virtual network that's just basically like a VM, and the same things you can do with a VM, like migrate a VM or migrate a VM or back up a VM or clone a VM. You're able to do that with an entire network, okay? And all of the security and all of the compliance policies that are there as well. And what we're starting to see, and we know that it's becoming a bit more mainstream now with NSX, is that we're doing an awful lot of partnerships. So I think the guy who was in from Bitdefender before us here was talking about NSX. I know that people like Intel Security, McAfee, Symantec, loads of others that I probably should name check, they're all working with us. But people like also Checkpoint, they're integrating with NSX, because NSX sits in a really interesting place in the data center. It sits between the hardware and the application in the actual hypervisor. So it means that the network, or the virtual network, knows everything about what the application needs and what the infrastructure can provide. And it can put security in that layer. So it means that if somebody's able to break into your application layer, they can't get at your security because it doesn't live in the application layer. It lives in between the application layer and the physical layer. It also means that you're not just looking at packets when you're looking at securing your network. You're actually able to get context from the applications as well. So anyway, we've expanded security with partnerships. We've integrated more with hardware vendors. So we're actually able to connect directly now to top-of-rack switches through a protocol called OVSDB, which is essentially a way to configure like paths inside in physical hardware. That's very much powering as well the Evo SDDC story with top-of-rack switches. So that ability to configure those physical devices to better integrate with the virtual network that lives in software is pretty cool. And we're doing that with people like Cumulus, Arista, and F5. And the last one there as well is essentially what I mentioned at the start, that scalability across data centers. Okay, so we just click on to the last one there, Mike. And just to give you an idea, so what we see NSX being going forward isn't just networking for VMware, okay? We're looking at this as kind of the new way that networking is going to be done across the data center, because we've got a version of NSX that doesn't work on vSphere. It works on other hypervisors, like KVM, okay? We're working on things around Hyper-V. We did a demo at VMworld where we were actually able to have the same security policy that runs in your own data center running against Amazon VMs, okay? So extending the same security policy across your entire IT infrastructure, not just your VMware stuff. And that's really interesting. And that's why people are plugging into us. So if you just build that out, Mike, all together, really gone. So what we're seeing here is that, yeah, we absolutely have our own capabilities to provide services for doing deployments, for kind of standardizing the security policies and things, and integrating with our automation software to basically allow you to create a network, a VM, and an entire application at the touch of a button. But we're also leveraging the best of breed technology from our partners. So leveraging those guys to be able to do offloaded antivirus capabilities, being able to do deep packet inspection, being able to do all sorts of things like in-memory inspection, which is what Bitdefender were talking about just before us here. And you can see all of those services are plugging into this platform. And this is the important thing, that platform, if that platform extends beyond VMware, if it goes over Hyper-V, if it goes over Amazon, if it goes over everything else, the same services that are plugging into that platform will be applicable across all of those different services. So you can kind of see where we're going with this. This is going to be a critical component in that idea of the operating system for the data center. Because the network is the thing that connects everything together. if you can get that running across your data centers, you know, you're going a pretty good way to actually getting it working, or getting that network OS or that data center OS thing kind of put into reality. So we'll kick on.
I thought you were going to say a Cisco buzzword there, but you didn't.
Did I? Yeah. Yeah. I was well trained. So basically, the session that was on concurrently with this, with Michael Armstrong, that will be recorded as well. So I would actually recommend looking at that. If I wasn't here, I'd be there looking at it. But if you want to check this stuff out as well and just get a feel for what NSX is all about, the hands-on labs are really, really good. I think you kind of have to go into it with an open mind and kind of say, okay, I'm not maybe going to do networking the same way as I used to do it, but there's some real benefits about thinking about a new way of doing networking as well, which is all centralized, all in software, automate as much as possible, and have consistency across everything else. So that's pretty much it, I think. Mike, I'll give back over to you to close, I suppose.
Thank you. Do we have any questions before we wrap up? We have gift cards to give away. If you ask a question, you get a gift card. All right, okay, don't all rush. Oh, yeah?
The automation product, how does that work with the orchestrator product?
Do you know the answer to that?
Yes. So actually, sorry about that, people on the video, that probably hurt. Basically, the vRealize automation is kind of like a layer that sits on top of Orchestrator. It uses Orchestrator workflows to actually implement the changes that you want. So it's kind of like a management system for those orchestration workflows, and allows you to put in kind of business logic around them. So that if you've done extensive work around Orchestrator and have a lot of work done with that and a lot of expertise in it, you're very well set up for actually working with vRealize automation. And vRealize automation is kind of going to expose those workflows in a way that's kind of maybe consumable by end users, or is a little bit more wrapped around the way that you want to deliver those services and automation workflows to your users.
So it's not going to replace it?
No, it's actually integrated, it uses it.
You said with the automation that you could do things within the VMs itself. So for instance, could you use the orchestrator to bring up a template, repatch it, and then drop it down again so you keep all your templates up to date?
Well, I suppose, which template? The VMware templates?
For instance, a Windows server, but the templates stay dormant until you need to deploy one for it. But you want to bring it up, install all the latest Microsoft patches, and drop it down again, so it always stays up to date. So when you need to deploy a new machine from it, you don't have to go through all the patching process.
Yeah, so basically you're able to update the template and the blueprint all the time. So for workloads that are already out there in the wild and being used, obviously you don't want to tear those down because they've got data. So you'll probably use existing tools around patch management, System Center, is going to, for Windows workloads. Yeah, so pretty much, as I said, it sits on top of Orchestrator. Orchestrator talks to pretty much everything, including System Center and other patching tools. So you could call what we call a day two or day two operation. The end user could actually do that. You could expose that functionality to the end user to say, patch this, or a patch is available, execute this patch or whatever. So yeah, it is possible to do. But yeah.
I think we should wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very
Cool.
much.
Thanks everyone. Cheers.